finally, looking at yourself, you're not. You've got ancestors that are very important to defining you and your work, as well as Sarah, who's somebody that has come up a lot during the interviews, and seems to be an essential part of what you're doing, and has also got her own projects. So do you want to tell us a little bit about how you've been influenced by your ancestors, and kind of how far back are we talking here, and what their influences have been, and then a little bit about what Sarah's project's been about?
Well, I would invite Sarah, but I know that she would say no, because she should really appear in this. She's the power behind the throne, as it were. Yeah. As I've said, the fact that my grandmother kept all these sort of photographs and papers of her family, and the importance of documents and photographs in holding together the British Empire, means that I've always been living with my ancestors. And it's not the ghosts of M.R. James and ghost stories, it's real people about whom I am told. As I point out to my students, the English are not an ancestor worshipping society. We tend to forget quite quickly. In China, it's different. In Africa, it's different. But in England, most people don't know much about anyone before their grandparents. The great-grandparents, maybe they've heard something about, and that's about it. So who do you think you are programs, usually the person is amazed once they get beyond grandparents. And I wasn't, I must say, particularly interested beyond my grandparents. I knew about my great-grandfather in Burma, roughly. But when my grandmother died, she left me boxes and chests of her papers and photographs, but also her father, the lawyer in Upper Burma, and going back and back and back. And in the last 15, 20 years, Sarah in particular has been going through all this material, often written in a very bad hand. It's often jumbled up and so on. And she's been sorting out and transcribing this collection. Now, again, there are many middle-class imperial families which would have collections like this, but they hardly ever have the time or energy to do anything with them. One volume might be transcribed and edited in some record series. But what Sarah's doing is, I think, I haven't seen anything else like it, because not only is she sorting it all out and transcribing it all, but she's spending a huge amount of effort finding out who the people are and what the events are. So footnoting and annotating and turning it into a really scholarly project, which will take a year or more for just one branch of one family. And again, now that one can actually do something with it, in other words, turn it into a PDF and make it available not only to my family, but anyone who's interested, or even publish it as a book which someone can buy if they want to. This has meant something new, which is that I can, rather like the tree which has as big roots as the branches above, what I've discovered is that the roots under the ground, in other words, my parents going backwards, are as rich and interesting as everything above the ground, in other words, my life. And so with Sarah's help and talking to her, we're gradually building the roots. And what you discover are various things. One is that although, as with functionalist anthropology, you think the past, because you know nothing about it, doesn't influence the present. As soon as you know the past, you see how much it does influence the present. So that now I know about my ancestors, I can see how much I am influenced by them. Not in a very specific or predestined way. I don't have to be an academic because my great-grandfather or cousin was a provost of King's. I didn't come to King's Cambridge because my M.R. James was at King's Cambridge or anything like that. It's not sort of destined like that. But there are elements of my character, the elements of my interests, and the way I think about the world, which, as I read about my ancestors, I can see what has happened is obvious. Basically, my mother was deeply influenced by her mother. Her mother was deeply influenced by her parents by her parents. So going back at least 3 or 4 generations, you need to go back to your great-grandparents or before, between people who almost directly influence you. And then as you go back further, you find elements of their characters and interests picked out. And so I understand, just as by reconstructing my life through my autobiography based on original documents, I can reconstruct before my life. I can see myself before I was born. So almost half of my character was there before I was even born, through my parents and then going backwards. So that's one great advantage of an extraordinary project made possible by computing and Sarah and my grandmother's collection of data. The other thing that's perhaps worth drawing out is that I'm, as a historian of Britain, England, which I've been, and of other imperial nations like China, having a first-hand set of documents about a particular family, and above all their letters, because Sarah and I have discovered that letters are the best of all sources. I worked a lot on diaries because I edited and wrote about the life of Ralph Jocelyn. And I thought diaries were the great source because people are writing about their lives. And I have a big collection of diaries here. But actually letters are a better historical source, because in a diary, you don't write down many obvious things which you just take for granted. And also you're writing to yourself. So there's a lot you don't have to explain. Whereas in a letter, the moment you write a letter, you have to try and get the other person to see what you're seeing. So they are fuller, richer, and they set the scene around you. So a good set of letters is the richest of all historical sources, personal sources, above anything else. And the fact that the English were great letter writers, British, because of the empire and the fact they kept in touch that way, means that we have these sets of letters going back to the later 18th century. And the family we can trace back in various branches. I often start with my 11th or 12th generation grandfather, who was the first white child born in Jamaica, 1655. And then from then on in Jamaica, the James family, which ended up with the Provost of King's and so on, we know a lot from 2 or 3 generations on. And then other branches. So with our system, you go, you've got 2 parents, 4 grandparents. If you go down like this, down several of these branches, we have clusters of letters from sort of late 18th century England, and then a lot in India, Burma, and so on from later on. And these form into basically an inner social history of the British Empire, because it's such an emotional subject, empire now, that nearly all the books you read about it are either quite strongly for it or against it, and even the best of them, like Jan Morris's and so on, are just skimming the surface.
Yes, I was going to ask this. I was wondering whether, given now you've got this archive and you've done this, or you're working on this project, are there things now that you're discovering about the English and the Empire and the Indian Empire in particular, that were surprising even to yourself, perhaps contrary to the stereotypes. And like you say, it's such an emotional and emotive and politicized subject now. It's quite difficult to know whether what you're getting is, kind of is what's actually real, or whether it's just the politics of the person writing it that's influencing it. So is there anything that you can say about what has been discovered through these letters and through this that for you was surprising or was and enlightening?
Well, reading them is similar to someone who has strong views on, say, China or Japan going there. I mean, most people in the West know nothing about China because they've never been there. They've never met seriously met a Chinese. And you can have many stereotypes and of either very strong negative or positive views about other countries if you don't actually spend time in them. Traveling back, the past is not a foreign country to me, though they do things differently there to a certain extent. And going back into imperial Britain in the 19th century in particular, is going back into a half-remembered country. It's not so different and it's not the same. And the people there are human beings. They're not so different from me. Now you may say, well, that's because you're an imperial brat, Alan, and heir to the worst of the Raj, but they're not different from anyone. Anyone reading this stuff with some sympathetic eye can see that faced with the dilemmas, the loneliness and the illness and the choices and the difficulties and the caste-like systems into which people were born, they would not act differently. Now, we can judge them now and we can condemn them, but you probably wouldn't have behaved very differently if you'd been there. And also you can understand their emotions and why they did things to a large extent. Sometimes they do cruel and vindictive and unpleasant things. They use language which we wouldn't use now, perhaps. But they're human beings who behaved within a very difficult, much more difficult than our world for most of us. And so you begin to actually understand. And what you find is the balance side. You find the exploitation and the arrogance and the class system and all those things, of course. But you also find the humor, the playfulness, the curiosity, the interest, because certainly my ancestors were very three-dimensional. They were interested, as I may have said before, in some of them, not all of them, were often very interested in some aspect of the society they were in, whether the wildlife or the flowers or something. And they often treated people quite reasonably within their lights, not very different. It was basically a class empire, so they treated the natives in the way they would treat the working class in England, not much different. They were largely invisible, in fact, in other words. So just as a mill owner might not actually see people at all, they're just invisible. To my grandparents' generation backwards, many of the natives were just invisible. And so basically you get a more warm and three-dimensional picture of empire than you would from many of the stereotypes of it. And you also get a picture of an empire which was dedicated to playfulness. I mean, what is extraordinary is the amount of energy and time spent by the British abroad on recreating the imagined world of England through play, through particularly drama, acting, musical performances, poetry, clubs, and of course games of all kinds and so on. So what united the empire, as unites the world now, was football and performing bad plays or good plays. And a lot of time in Upper Burma or wherever it was about playful behavior, because what is very central to this particular empire is that it was an empire of the mind. As I've said before, the French and continental empires, you went there and you became part of the Vietnamese or Argentinian world, and you became absorbed into its culture and even its marriages. The British remained British wherever they were. And so if you went to Simla or Nainital or um, Imperial Delhi, you were basically in Bournemouth, but it was a bit hotter. So, and there were these sort of invisible servants all around you. So that's the feeling you get from a lot of this. I mean, the set of letters that Sarah and I are working on at the moment, which is about 4 generations back, a grandfather who is in India writing letters home. And a lot of his letters is about, well, gardening and about playing snooker and money worries and so on. You know, they're worrying about the same things as we're worrying about: illness and children and money and will he find a wife and so on and so on. So I found the same thing in these ancestors as I've had the shock when I read Ralph Jocelyn's diary, that I thought these people would be very different from me. People in the 17th century would, you know, once you got inside them, they would be different. And I thought my great-great-grandparents would be different people. But when I read about their school lives and what they were taught and how their parents taught them, I see it repeating and repeating and repeating. And my life was not really, many ways, different. The humor is the same. It's very understandable. You don't have to learn a new language to understand their emotional and intellectual structures. But that's a feature of the English system in general. It's one of the peculiarities. Anyone, if they can master the language, can understand Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare's emotional structures and inner worlds and poetry of that period and later, you know, anyone can understand it, or even novels of a slightly later period. In many countries, if you go back into these earlier periods, even in France, the language and the conventions and so on have changed so much that they feel very period specific. So even Chaucer, I mean, you know, translated Chaucer's Canterbury Tales of the early 14th century, you know, the emotions there are just, you know, what we in our school, you know.
But this is your thesis again, isn't it? That we've been modern before other people were modern. We've been modern for ages, and
Right.
that's why we can do that, whereas the French and Spanish and people can't.
Yeah. So my ancestors, so they taught me that they were modern too, and I admire and feel warm towards most of them, and see how much I'm just living out the kinds of lives they would have led out, but in slightly better material circumstances.